Hello everyone, my name is Matt Williams. I'm the Access Fellow at Jesus College in Oxford, and today I'm going to talk about politics, but a slightly unusual area of political study, which is language in politics. It's actually not unusual to study language in politics at university, but when people talk about politics, they tend to get fixated on things like Brexit and who's in charge and what Donald Trump has tweeted within the last 24 hours. But actually, language is incredibly powerful, and ultimately, political science is the study of power. So, of course, we're fascinated with language. And I was particularly struck recently when someone told me that words are weapons, and they were saying it in the fairly sort of standard way that anyone uses a figure of speech. They were using it just to highlight a point they were making. But I began to think about that turn of phrase, words are weapons, and I suppose as I often do, I took it a bit literally. I sort of thought, well, can words actually cause us harm as individuals or as communities? Is it possible that just, little congregations of letters have the potential to cause actual harm? Maybe not physical harm, possibly, but probably not, but certainly emotional harm, maybe psychological, ideological harm. So I had a real deep think about whether or not words are in fact weapons, because if they are, then they're totally uh, in my range of vision. Because as a political scientist, I'm interested in pretty much any tool for using, abusing, and manipulating power. That's my bread and butter. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's get started. Let's begin with a few opening quotes. First of all, I should just say, if you want to get in touch with me at all, please feel free to find me on Twitter, either at Jesus_access, that's for the college, or my personal at MAGL_Williams. Be very happy to answer any questions you might have about this or anything to do with Oxford University or anything for that matter. So let's start with a few opening quotes just to sort of get a sense of what various people have said about the potential power of language, whether or not language can be a tool for political influence. So this is a pretty important quote. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now those are the opening lines of the Gospel according to St. John. They are really fascinating in terms of theological doctrine, but also just as a piece of literature, if you like. It's absolutely brilliantly written and also fascinating conceptually. In the beginning was the Word, capitalized. So prior to existence, there was language. And this helps us understand to a certain extent the story of Genesis, where in the beginning there was darkness and God said, "Let there be light." It seems to be that light is therefore seen more conceptually as enlightenment and the power to understand reality, not just necessarily physical light. So this is really interesting. It's a very clear distinction being made between Judeo-Christian monotheism and the various polytheistic paganisms that were around in Europe and Asia at the time that the Gospels were written. Many of those religions worshipped natural phenomena like the sun and the stars and the moon. Interestingly, in the Genesis version of creation, the sun, the stars, and the moon were created on the fourth day, not the first day. So there's a clear distinction being made in theological law, if you like, between the power of thought and of language versus the power of the celestial bodies, which is what the pre-Christian and pre-Jewish religions were more interested in. Anyway, I just found that quote extremely interesting. Another quote, perhaps more familiar to many of us, comes from Albus Dumbledore. Words are, in my not so humble opinion, our most inexhaustible source of magic, capable of both inflicting injury and remedying it. It's a great turn of phrase that J.K. Rowling has captured there, really pinning down the potential majesty of words. And as I said earlier, words are just collections of letters. They're really fascinating, but of course they do so much more than that. They help us structure our reality. They help us communicate between total strangers. They help us form our thoughts. They help us frame our ambitions for life. They help us make sense of our dreams. Words are terrifically powerful, but because we use them all the time, I fear that we might take them for granted a lot of the time, but they're actually incredibly interesting and incredibly important. So let's move on. What's first? So first of all, I'd like you to just have a little think for yourself. What do you think is a particularly powerful word or words? So have a little think, maybe pause the video for a minute. Trust your gut. What's sort of flitting to the surface of your mind at the moment? If someone says to you, what's a really powerful word? Have a little think. Now, the sort of things you might want to think about with regard to powerful is, well, does a word have power to move? Now, you could think about power to move in a physical sense, the power to physically get people to move from one place to the other. If, for instance, I screamed fire in a crowded theatre, people would move, right? They'd run to the nearest exit. So that would be a word which, in that particular context, would have motive power. Power in a sort of physical sense, that the way we often understand the notion of power. But then you could also think about powerful in other ways, right? So we could think about powerful with regard to emotions. So let's say I said to my wife, as I did on Valentine's Day, that I love her, right? That sounds quite soppy perhaps, but that's what I said. Now that's a word with power because it's a designation of a class to which our relationship belongs as far as I'm concerned. I'm defining the strength of our relationship. And of course, I'm hoping plaintively that she'll return that sentiment and she'll agree, yes, our relationship is one founded on love. But the word love has an extraordinary emotional power. If one person says to another, I love you, and it's not reciprocated, then you really see the potential power of it as a concept. If someone's told that they are loved, they can have the classic fight or flight reaction. They can start to just seize up with fear. And that's a reaction that you would get if someone pulled a knife on you. So it's a really fascinating reaction just to 4 little letters. Now you might decide that love isn't as powerful as the word hate, which is similarly would elicit an emotional response. If someone came up to me in the street, even a complete stranger, and said that they hated me, I would be pretty shocked and scared. But if a friend from childhood came up and said that they hated me, I would be devastated. That would stay with me for life. So these are hugely important emotional ideas. But what about sort of ideological power? Because you can take powerful in other directions. What about words like success or money or power itself? Power is in itself a powerful word. Or even a word like violence has all sorts of ideological ambiguities to it. So you might think that is a very powerful word. And of course, we haven't even mentioned words that are taboo and that cause offence. So you could have thought of swear words as being particularly powerful, or maybe a slur, a racial or a homophobic slur. These are words that can be used in order to upset someone or to demean them or to cause substantial offence, and that you could say is an obvious manifestation of their power. Anyway, this is clearly not a question to which there is a specific answer. The key thing is to think of an answer and come up with a sound justification for your answer that you're happy with. So don't just listen to me, try and have a think about it for yourself and think very deeply about what it means for a word to have power. Okay? So, moving on. What's next? Well, let's have a little think a bit more about our terms. Now, you see I've put our in quotation marks there because that's part of my interest in language, is that I want to know who's in charge. Language is a rule-bound system. The very fact that I can communicate now with strangers over the internet is because we have language that is defined by shared rules. The problem is that those rules aren't shared in the sense that we all have a right to make them or break them. In fact, those rules are quite specifically set out for us by other people, usually by parents and by teachers. But those parents and teachers themselves were taught the rules by their own parents and teachers. So who in fact does control, who regulates language, the rules that we use to speak? So that's something to think about with regard to whether or not language is in any way owned by the people that use it, or whether there is a particular elite, perhaps, that tell us how particularly we ought to use language in a way that they feel is correct. But let's think a bit more carefully about some of the key terms. I mean, what even is language? So, in academic study, sometimes people don't use the word language because it isn't particularly precise. Language can refer to a whole range of phenomena. A somewhat more commonly used term in universities, well, depending on the university and the professor, but an often used term, I should probably say, is semiotics, which is the study of symbolic representation. So that doesn't need to be language in the sense of words and sentences, that can be any symbolic representation. So even a red light representing the concept of stopping and a green light representing the concept of moving and going would be a form of semiotics. It is an understanding that is shared by a community of what various ideas mean, what various symbols represent. Okay? Now, language is a particular subset of semiotics where we perhaps have a more complex rule base than with regard to the colours of traffic lights, but it nonetheless achieves much the same goal, which is to try and structure the reality around us through symbols and through what we think those symbols mean. Now, what is language? Is it uniquely human in biological terms? Now, this is a particularly difficult question to answer. We certainly know that many species of animal communicate with each other, and they do so in a way that is obviously meaningful to them. So whales sing very beautifully across oceans, and I don't know, dogs bark at each other, and cockerels salute the sun in the morning. So all of these things are forms of communication. The thing is, it's not clear that they are symbolic representation in the sense that the cockerel, for instance, is using a concept of morningness and is trying to represent that through his crowing to the sun. It seems more likely that the cockerel is just awake and is saying, I'm awake. There's nothing particularly sort of complex or multi-layered or contextual about the way the cockerel is using language. In fact, it has been argued that there are only two species known to science that can refer to an idea that is not within their immediate perceptual range. Now, I need to unpack that a little bit. Basically, what that means is that for practically every species that makes noises and sings and chatters and communicates with each other in groups, what they are doing is referring to something that is immediately perceived. It could be something that they've seen, it could be something that they've heard, it could be something that they've smelt or felt or whatever. Only human beings and, interestingly, bees, as in honeybees, etc., are able to refer to something that they are not actually perceiving. So, for instance, you could shut your eyes, block your ears, bung up your nose and you could talk, maybe not happily, but you could certainly talk about, I don't know, trees and ice cream and golf and Pokemon and all sorts of things that you're not actually perceiving, right? Now, what bees do, interestingly, is that they will come back to their hive and they will perform a dance called the waggle dance, by which they point at the direction of some pollen laden flowers, and the waggle determines how far away those flowers are. So the number of shakes of their tail, if you like, describes how far away the tasty pollen heavy flowers are. So the bees are not actually able to see or smell or certainly not touch those flowers, but they can remember where they are and they can point the rest of their hive in the right direction. So as far as we know, that is it. It's just human beings and bees that are able to refer to things that are not perceived. And that, I think, points us to something that is perhaps uniquely human, which is our ability to go into some degree of complexity about phenomena that we not only cannot perceive, but also that we represent symbolically. Because with the bees, what they're talking about is a specific flower that is in a specific direction and is desirable because it's got loads of pollen on it. As human beings, we can talk about flowers collectively, and we can talk about them as an idea, as a group. We don't need to talk just about specific flowers, we can talk about the notion of a flower. We could even have a long argument about what distinguishes a flower from a shrub if we really wanted to, or what is the difference between pollen and petals. These are sort of arguments about the very conceptual notion of what it means to be a flower, which, as far as we know, bees are incapable of. Anyway, let's have a little look at the architecture of communication, which, of course, for human beings is the brain. Now, I could have included, and perhaps should have included, parts of the spinal column, even some of the nerve endings in the gut, which some neuroscientists have argued are important to parts of our cognition, the so-called second brain. When people say you think with your gut, well, to a certain extent, that's literally true. Anyway, I think it's reasonable at the start to talk about the brain in our heads, at least. And when it comes to communication through language, what has been found, especially through the use of MRI scanners, is that it is extremely complicated. We can see when people talk in an MRI scanner that blood flows all throughout the brain, and therefore that suggests that there are various different areas, various what are called gyruses, that are stimulated in order to communicate. So I can't just point out a particular part of the brain that is the component responsible for a particular communicative function in human beings. It's not as straightforward as that. So, for instance, if we were to talk about eyesight, I could tell you that basically the red-coloured or pinky-coloured part on this drawing of the brain is largely responsible for what we see. Okay? But when it comes to language, it's much more complicated than that. One generalization to make is that the outer layers of the brain, so those are the bits that are coloured in, pink, green, yellow, and blue, are, in evolutionary terms, the newest bits. They're the most human bits. Our primate ancestors don't really have many of these components to the brain, or at least not as developed as we do. And we know that a lot of these areas are responsible, both in isolation and in communication with each other, in forming words, sentences, and language. What's particularly intriguing is that the base of the brain, which on this map is not coloured in, it's just white, which is in evolutionary terms the oldest part of the brain and is shared by most of our vertebrate ancestors, is important when it comes to powerful words. So remember we were discussing earlier words that elicit a very strong reaction. Well, it's that part of the brain part of which is also covered up by the coloured parts in this particular drawing, that would be going haywire if someone screamed fire in a crowded theatre, or if someone used a really inappropriate racial slur in order to upset someone. It's that part of the brain, broadly speaking, the emotional centres of the brain, which not only regulate how we manage or sometimes fail to manage our emotions, but also manage the physiology of reacting to those emotions. So whether or not we start getting a heightened heart rate, or our pupils dilate in order to take in more light, or we start sweating, or we start feeling butterflies in our stomach, a lot of these reactions will also be elicited by the base of the brain. So language is really fascinating, and to try and pin it down in a sort of neurophysiological sense is pretty tough, but it's interesting to try at least. So let's have a little bit more think about what power means, because that's another term that I've been throwing around perhaps a little bit flippantly. Power is often conceived of as the ability to do something which without your input would not be done. But you could also think about power in a negative sense, the power to stop something happening that without your input would have happened. So, for instance, the word no, simple two-letter word no, has the capacity for extraordinary power, but it's not the power to achieve something most of the time, it's the power to prevent something happening. It also, if someone says, no, you can't do that, it also suggests that that individual has the capacity to grant license. So if a parent or a teacher has said to you, no, you mustn't do or say that, then implicit in the word no is that individual's right, perceived or otherwise, to tell you that you can't do something. So think about power from multiple perspectives. It's not just the ability to do, it's also the ability to stop. And for some political theorists, you can take it another step further, that power has an ideological component. In other words, not only the ability to do or the ability to stop, but also the ability to make people think and feel the way you think and feel, so that they do and don't do what you want them to do without you even having to say it. Now that's a really extraordinary power. That's sort of getting close to mass hypnosis. If you convince lots of people to think the way you think, they will behave the way you want them to without you even having to be there. So that is a potentially extraordinary degree of power. Think, for instance, about political leaders that manage to convince a community to perceive the world in a specific way. They may use language in particular forms in order to encourage various interpretations at all times, regardless of whether or not they are present. I mean, this is a particularly sort of grotesque example, but it's an important one, which was how Hitler and the Nazis dehumanized Jewish people in Germany and Austria and most of Europe, of course. What they would do is that they would associate the notion of Judaism with bestiality. So they would describe Jewish people as being similar to animals. And what that achieved was to get the German people to constantly associate anything Jewish with something uncouth, unclean, and unhuman, such that German people would then make those associations on their own without having to be forced to do so at any moment. So that is a degree of ideological power, which is deeply disturbing and as we saw, ultimately had not only rhetorical impact, but also appalling mass murderous impact. So think very carefully about what power means. And then finally, what language is ultimately meant to do is to help us understand the universe around us and to make some sense of it. But how do we work out which is the correct interpretation of any word? Even a word as humble as no or yes can be, depending on the context, quite ambiguous. And context is another component that you should think very deeply about. So far we've been talking mostly about text, about what words are, if you like. But a text cannot be considered in isolation. It is dependent to a very substantial degree on its context and also often its subtext. In other words, what has not been expressed that is implicit but essential to the understanding of that word. So one of the potential problems with language, and the reason why it's so interesting to political scientists, is that so little of it is objective. So much of it depends on who's speaking, why they're speaking, under what circumstances they're speaking, with what intent are they speaking. All of these contextual and subtextual variables will change the text. The text is not constant and uniform, therefore. So that's something to have a think about. So let's move on. Okay, now let's think a little bit more about who makes the rules and who enforces the rules of language, because I think this is a crucial component. I mentioned earlier that language is a rule-bound system, that you are taught the rules at school and at home, or in other contexts. You're told that you're not using the right word, or you're not using the right grammar, or that's the wrong pronunciation. But who comes up with this vast array of complex intersecting rules? It's a difficult question. I mean, who in fact controls language? I think we're tempted to delude ourselves to a certain extent that we all control our own language, that we have a fairly democratic approach to language creation and dissemination. Now, this delusion is certainly propagated by the editorial policy of the Oxford English Dictionary. The Oxford English Dictionary decides on what words mean and what words should go into the dictionary according to usage. So the dictionary is, in theory at least, reflecting back at us the way we use our own language. So, for instance, the dictionary recently added words like selfie and Brexit and hangry because they were being used. So it seemed, at least prima facie, that the dictionary was just trying to reflect back at us the way we use our own language. My favourite example of this is the word literally. Literally means that, or used to mean anyway, that something happened as described, according to the words described. The opposite of literally, the antonym, is something like figuratively. A figure of speech is where something didn't happen as described, but you're using a figure of speech in order to try and animate the discussion. So, for instance, if I was to say, I died when that person walked through the door, it would be a figure of speech because you don't literally die, otherwise you wouldn't be able to recount the action that took place. But a lot of people in English have been misusing the word literally. So they've been saying something like, I literally died when he walked through the door. I mean, which is nonsense, of course. But because the dictionary is so democratic, at least in theory, there is now a secondary definition for the word literally in the dictionary, which means not literally, it means figuratively. So you can now use the word literally to mean literally or figuratively, which means, get this, that the word literally is now literally meaningless, thanks to the dictionary's democratic editorial policy. So that might seem slightly mad and bonkers, but bear in mind that there are nonetheless editors at the dictionary. So it can't be truly democratic because at the end of the day there are people in a pretty building in Oxford that make decisions as to how specifically to pin down the meaning of a word. And with some words that's going to be extraordinarily difficult. I mean, take a word like success. Could you write down a pithy sort of 3 or 4 sentence definition of the word success? It's extraordinarily difficult and often quite personal what success means, and yet someone has to be that editor and come up with their own preferred definition. Now this is an issue perhaps for English, but at least the policy of the Oxford English Dictionary is democratic, at least nominally. In France, the dictionary is largely controlled by the Académie Française, which is based in Paris and has a membership that are described as the immortals, and I'm afraid I'm not joking about that, and they decide which words are correct French words. And they do so because they are genuinely scared that French is being sullied and infiltrated by foreign languages in colloquial French. In particular, they're worried about English and Arabic, which are becoming very popular amongst young French people in urban areas in particular. So, for instance, a lot of people in France would say le weekend to describe the weekend. But the French dictionary doesn't recognize le weekend as proper French because it's English. So they came up with an alternative, which is le fin de semaine, the end of the week, in order to try and prevent people from using le weekend. Now, this may all sound completely uninteresting and unimportant, but bear in mind that if you don't use language according to the way the dictionary describes it, then you can be punished for it. You could, for instance, lose marks in an exam, especially if you spelt something incorrectly. You could potentially miss out on a job. So it can be extremely important. And I think that's why we need to move on to things like grammar and pronunciation. I imagine that everyone listening to this will have been told at one point in their life that they've mispronounced a word. But have you ever thought deeply about what it means to pronounce a word, quote, correctly? How is that determined? Is pronunciation derivative from bold logic? Is it just something where if we go to the roots of a word, we can find out the correct pronunciation and then we can all agree? Well, no, it isn't. I mean, in some cases, there are logical inferences that we can make about the pronunciation of words, and there are some commonalities in pronunciation. But much of pronunciation is just arbitrary. It doesn't have any logical basis to it whatsoever. It just depends on the community that you reside in. So take a word like scone or scone, depending on your community. There is no way to resolve the argument about whether or not it's a scone or a scone. So I've heard people say that, well, it must be scone because if you drop the S off the front, then it's a cone, and so clearly logic dictates that it must be scone. The problem is that logic doesn't pertain here. I mean, if you drop the S off the word slaughter, you get laughter. So clearly logic is not the only guiding principle in determining pronunciation. So your next step might be to say, well, let's look at precedent. What's the earliest known pronunciation of words? The problem with that is that the pronunciation of words changes according to fads and fashions and contexts. So trying to work out the earliest known pronunciations is not particularly instructive either. I mean, for instance, this is quite an interesting example. The word ask, we have some documentary evidence to suggest was pronounced amongst white English people in the 17th century as ox, as in the way that is sometimes said by African Americans today. I asked you a question. So the theory being that the white settlers in the colonists that took slaves across the Atlantic to America were using the word ask in that way, and it was picked up by the African American population who continue to use it in that way. And it's just that the white population changed the way they pronounced the word ask and therefore decided that their new pronunciation was correct and everyone else was wrong. Now, the reason that this is potentially important and the reason that language can cause people harm is that if someone was to say in an interview amongst some slightly bigoted racists, oh, could you ask me that question again? They might be judged as having a certain level of education or not being particularly suitable for the job simply because of the way they pronounce a word, which is completely bonkers. Ultimately, language is about a shared symbolic reconstruction of the universe. In other words, we need to be able to talk to each other in a meaningful way. If someone tells me that they asked me a question or they asked me a question, I get what they're saying either way. It really doesn't matter. It makes no difference to our ability to have a meaningful conversation, how they pronounce that word. And yet, pronunciation is a very common way of judging someone. And that's one of the things that we as human beings certainly do share with other species, of primate in particular, which is that we're always on the lookout for ways of determining whether someone is in our in-group or the out-group. And if someone says scone rather than scone, you might instantly think, oh, they're one of the others, they're dangerous, I hate them. And it's amazing to me how angry people get with regard to what they conceive of as mispronunciation. But so much of pronunciation is completely arbitrary, and my thinking is, provided you know what someone's saying, who cares? Right? Who cares? If someone calls it a scone or a scone, I couldn't care less. I know what they're talking about, let's just move on. And given that there is no logical way of resolving the debate, you might as well just live and let live, for goodness sake. And the potential damage that can be caused to someone that has a regional accent or an accent that's derived from a particular ethnic community, that is particularly pernicious because that can deny people all sorts of opportunities and for no good reason whatsoever. So pronunciation is a potentially extraordinarily powerful mechanism. English ultimately is a mongrel tongue. It's not some sort of pure rule-based system. It just depends on currents of power, social, political, and economic. The reason that the quote-unquote correct pronunciations often sound relatively posh is simply because those people have the most power. They're not right in how they pronounce words because there is no such thing as right for the most part. They're just more powerful. And that's the scary part with language, that there's this hidden current of political and economic power that language is used not solely as a way to reconstruct the universe around us, but also as a way to hurt people and to pull them down. And that's genuinely terrifying. So why do we have standardized language at all? Why, for instance, are there dictionaries? And why are you told to spell words in particular ways? I mean, that's another area that we haven't touched on yet, but why would it matter if you spell the word colour with a U or without a U? I mean, again, it doesn't seem to really matter very much if your ultimate goal is just to communicate. And one of the answers to this, although there are many potential theories, but one prominent one is industrialization. The standardization of language coincides with the industrialization of the economy. So as towns began to grow and as rural dwellers moved into those towns, there was an increasing interest in standardizing their education and improving their education so that they would be able to participate in a new industrial labour market. Now, part of that process was to ensure that they were replaceable parts in an industrial mechanism. Just as industry itself creates replaceable parts for machines, human beings to a certain extent become replaceable parts as well. You want everyone to sound fairly similar in order to make them easily replaceable and replicable. So this may sound slightly dark, but the industrialization of the economy made human beings to a certain extent into replaceable parts. Because if you think about it carefully, Shakespeare would spell the same word differently in the same play on occasions in order to improve the scan of verse or to just play around with the vowel sounds, for instance. And spelling, in the sense that there was a, quote, correct spelling, is a pretty modern phenomenon. And it coincides not only with industrialization, but also nationalism, this sense that language is a pillar of our shared culture and that it has to be protected. And this is certainly something that lives within the French tradition of keeping the French language pure from English and Arabic influences. There are various other ways by which the rules are propagated, one of which, of course, is habit. We don't often reflect on how language is formed or how it is regulated, and we tend to use it quite customarily and quite habitually. And this is why, hopefully, this talk is quite useful, because it'll stop you just taking for granted the words that I'm even saying right now. And one thing I'd quite like you to do is to take a minute, again, maybe pause the video for a second, and try and think of a new word. Try and take back a little bit of control. And new words are invented all the time, but very few of them make it. Very few of them get into the mainstream. So what I want you to imagine is not only whether or not you could come up with a new word and determine its meaning, but also how you would disseminate it such that your word made it into the Oxford English Dictionary within, let's say, 5 years' time. How would you do that? Have a think. Now, my suspicion is that if you wanted your word to go viral, if you like, you would need to have quite a lot of power. You would need to have a lot of cultural power, a lot of economic power, a lot of political power maybe. You'd need that sort of influence that you could start getting millions and millions of people to use your words the way you want them to. Now you can maybe see this phenomenon take place on a smaller scale with slang. You may, in your school or in your community, have slang, which is short for short language. And what slang does is that it allows a community that is relatively powerless to come up with a set of words and sometimes even grammatical rules that allows them to communicate without others being able to understand what they're saying. I mean, one of the most famous examples is Cockney rhyming slang. Now, Cockney rhyming slang was partly designed to allow people in the East End of London to talk about their criminal enterprises without the police being able to understand what they were talking about. The issue is that slang, the same as regular language, is controlled by those with power. So if you think to the slang that you might have used at school, those people that tell you what words to use and how to use them will be those with power. They'll be, to put it crudely, the cooler kids, the people that have influence, cultural influence within the school. So slang is just a smaller version of what happens with regular languages, that those with power and influence tell us, the rest of us, how we should talk proper, basically. So, let's move on. Now, this is a particularly complicated question, but an absolutely foundational one. What comes first? Is it meaning or language? Now, have a think about that. That's a really intriguing question. Now, on one level, you might think, well, it's obvious. It's got to be meaning. In other words, the thing comes before the referent to that thing. So, for instance, there were fluffy four-legged things that sniff trees, and then we slapped the word dog onto them in order to make sense of what they were and to collectively identify them. Now, that, broadly speaking, is the argument put forward by structuralism, which is that language brings together the abstract ideas, such as dogness, with the concrete reality, which is specific dogs, in order to structure our lives and to make sense of our culture. Okay, so that makes intuitive sense. You know, trees obviously pre-exist the word tree. The problem comes that there are many words for which that causal pathway is not so straightforward. And this has therefore been criticised in particular by post-structuralism, which is a school of philosophy that and sociolinguistics that was particularly prominent in France and continental Europe from roughly the sort of interwar period, and it's continued to have prominence thereafter. Now, the primary critique is that it's not just a straightforward case that things come before words, that sometimes words come before the things that they represent. I mean, take the word dog. I mean, dog is a referent for four-legged fluffy things that sniff trees. But what else does dog mean? Dog can also be used as a slur directed at a woman in order to describe her as unattractive. It can be used as a compliment when used to refer to a man, in the sense of, he's my dog, he's one of my in-group. So that's an interesting finding, that the word dog means different things from just the fluffy four-legged thing that sniffs trees. And so language doesn't just bridge this gap between the very complex universe around us and our own concrete reality. Language can create meaning. It is not just created by meaning. And specifically that people with power can use language to hurt each other or for other goals associated with a power asymmetry. I mean, if we move on from dog to bitch, what does bitch mean? Well, originally, of course, it meant a female dog, but clearly that word is now more commonly associated in an extremely derogatory sense in regards to women. So it's not just the case that we had female dogs and we needed to find a word for it. We then had a word for female dog, which we then started using for other purposes, for political purposes, for hurting people. So this is where you can see that language can actually be a weapon. It can cause harm. And, it shouldn't be underestimated how much harm language can cause. Some of the homophobic or racial or misogynistic slurs that people use can be really devastating to people. Besides the word itself and its connotations and its denotations, is also the sense that someone has a right to label others using these words. And that sense of righteousness is itself a political act. If an individual starts throwing around, words like bitch, then that person is saying, I have a right to demean you. I am better than you. And that is a sort of the subtext of what they say. And it's an intensely political thing. So remember what we were saying at the start about the power of language. Well, it's there all the time, and it's absolutely crucial. Okay, so what would post-structuralists do about it? What's their remedy? I mean, did they just sit around and look at how we use language and get terribly depressed at how we use words like bitch and not reflect on it? Well, no. They advocate, in particular, a method called deconstruction. A deconstruction is, if you like, a very pernickety, very pedantic form of analysis. I absolutely love it because it just takes nothing for granted. You cannot look at the universe around you without asking lots of good questions about why do we do this? Why do we say that? Why is a scone pronounced as scone and not scone, or whatever way you want to pronounce it? The best way to think about deconstruction, to my mind, is to act and think like a toddler. Look at the world as if you've never seen it before and deconstruct every component of it. Pick apart the very structures of language and lay bare the power that is just beneath the surface. Now, this method is associated with many thinkers, but perhaps its most famous exponent is Jacques Derrida. And he drew attention in particular to misleading binary opposites. So have a think about some binary opposites. Now, binary opposite might be, for instance, male and female. So we try and categorize human beings into one of those two categories. The problem is that people might not fit into those categories, that those are categories that are derivative of language rather than of biology or even sociology. So we use those categories of male and female because they simplify the universe, not because they are accurate. Okay, so have a think about some other potential binaries and try some deconstruction. Think about what's maybe wrong with splitting up the world into this one or the other construction, and how we might try and do something a bit better. So again, maybe pause the video, maybe have a think, maybe have a chat with some people around you. What, other than say male and female, is a common way of putting phenomena on two poles of a spectrum that you think might cause some harm? Okay, some other examples you might have thought of were gay and straight. It's another common binary which may be misleading. You could have thought of even powerful and weak. I mean, there's a lot of the ways that we structure language is as if there is one or the other, that there are no shades of grey. And I suppose to a certain extent that is inherent in language. Language is a simplification of reality, but in simplifying we can do quite a lot of damage to the complexity of reality, which I think is one of the fundamental points that we need to get to towards the end of this talk. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the regulation of language. Have a think, is there in fact freedom of speech? There may be in law freedom of speech, but is there in fact? Is there in reality? Now, I want you to think much more deeply about freedom of speech than you might otherwise do. Commonly, when we hear the term freedom of speech, we think about the right to protest or the right to voice your opinions in a particular context. But I want you to think even more deeply than that. Are you free to pronounce words the way you want to pronounce them? Are you free to spell words the way you want to spell them? Well, often you are not. No. If you misspelt even the word freedom in freedom of speech, you might not be taken very seriously. You would lose power. But why? Why does it matter that words are spelt in a very particular way or pronounced in a very particular way? Often it's because of the extraordinary degree of standardization in language that we are all compelled and impelled to think of language as being very tightly regulated. But is that really necessary? Now, I'm not necessarily advocating anarchy of speech, in other words, completely unregulated speech, because that would fail at any meaningful shared communication. What I'm getting at is that many of the rules are arbitrary, they don't make any sense, and they are derivative of power, therefore, rather than reason. And because they're derivative of power, they can be used by those with power to cause harm to those without. So just as certain men might use the word bitch in order to hurt women, or employers might listen to the way someone pronounces words or spells words in order to make fairly misleading assumptions about their education, these are ways that people use language in order to wield power, often unconsciously, but it's there. So when it comes to freedom of speech, look a bit deeper. Not only do you have the freedom in law, but do you have the freedom in reality? Can you structure your own reality using language in a way that genuinely reflects you? Or are you created by language? Are your thoughts, your perceptions themselves derivative of the rules of language you've been taught? That you can't help but separate the world into binary opposites because that's just the way you were brought up. Now, this is a really, really difficult question, so do take some time and do think about it for yourself. I'm not trying to force you into any particular conclusion here. This is very much up to you. Okay, so let's move on. So let's get to the nub of the of the lecture, the supposed violence of language. And what am I talking about here? Now, is it possible that language is the symptom or the cause of violence? Now, it could be that the way we use language in order to control or hurt other people is more the consequence of our violent tendencies as a species rather than it causing violence. That's, of course, possible, but I would imagine that it's a bit of a complex interplay. It's neither the case that language entirely is the result of our tendencies towards using power. It could also create it, just as the post-structuralists argued that words are not simply derived from meaning, but words create their own meaning. I think there's an interesting interplay between language and violence. But what does violence even mean? I mean, that in itself is a word that is defined by dictionaries and by individuals and by common associations. So again, even the concept of violence is a symbolic referent that we may struggle to interpret. So you've got to think very deeply about what it means to be violent. And quite an interesting interpretation of violence is any act, physical or otherwise, that diminishes the autonomy of others. So if you think about that quite carefully, that means if you use language or physicality or money or anything in order to make someone less able to be themselves, then that is a violent act. So if I was to call a stranger on the street a bitch, then that could be described as violent because I was arrogating to myself the right to classify someone in a certain way. And by classifying them, I was diminishing them. I was not only upsetting them, but I was also saying, I'm better than you, I have the right to call you a bitch, and you are less than me. So you could say that even that is a violent act because it diminishes that other person. Now, it's not violent in the traditional sense that we would usually understand violence, but that's pretty much one of the main points of this lecture, which is that the way we typically understand words is derived from dictionaries and shared understandings, but maybe we should be more questioning of how we use language and who tells us what is the correct usage. Okay, now if you want to think quite specifically, so I've already mentioned the possibility of misogynistic language. So is misogynistic language itself a result of us being an inherently sexist society or an inherently sexist species? Or can the way we use language even cause sexism and misogyny? It could be that we sort of lazily lapse into various habits and customs of language use, and that is reinforcing this sense of right and wrong and powerful and powerless, that even just the sort of lazy propagation of words like bitch just give new generations the sense that it's okay to refer to women as if they are female dogs. So again, it's just thinking through these things is what gives us some control back. So finally, here's an idea. Representation, symbolic or otherwise, is always violent. Now, representation means the representation of an idea in one context to another. Okay, so whenever you're talking about something that happened somewhere else to friends or family or teachers or whomever, you are representing what happened through words. Because you are not able to accurately present what happened, representation will always diminish the complexity of reality. It's impossible to perfectly recreate or represent what happened through words, and therefore it is always violent. It's always violent in the sense that it diminishes the complexity of reality. Now, this argument poses quite a substantial problem for, well, pretty much everything, but in particular academia, because in universities we are constantly trying to represent very complicated ideas about the universe and about society and about individuals in simplified ways. That is essentially what we do. So, should we just give up? Is academia inherently violent? Well, I would argue no, because we have various tools to reflect on the potential violence of representation. And another French linguist and philosopher called Michel Foucault would, in particular, advise that we constantly question, constantly answer, and constantly critique. He would, I hope, agree with me that acting a little bit more like a toddler would be very important, because toddlers question, answer, and critique without inhibition, without feeling embarrassed or ashamed of asking good, perceptive questions about the reality they're confronted with. That is what can give you some power back. Critical analysis. Don't take anything for granted. If someone tells you you should pronounce the word scone as scone or ask as ox or whatever, think about it and ask them why. Why do I have to do that? What is the basis of that? Is the basis logic and reason, or is the basis of that power? Are you telling me to talk a certain way because you want me to be more like you so that I'm more comforting to you? Or do you want me to speak a certain way because there's some sort of logical imperative for me to do so? My argument is that in so many aspects of language, logic is rarely at play. A lot of it comes down to just communal values and arbitrary rules that are just based up by power relations. The response to that is not to just give up and to stop speaking or to use language however you like, but it's just to reflect on it. Take some power back by being conscious of the very limitations of your freedom of speech, because it is certainly true in reality that words are weapons.